There's something uniquely terrifying about being home alone, when every sound, every shadow feels magnified. But what if those unsettling moments weren't just your imagination? Tonight, I'll take you through 7 stories where being home alone became a waking nightmare. So dim the lights, settle in, and brace yourself for the unexpected. And don't forget, your stories could be next. If you've had a chilling experience, share it below or send it to the email in the description. Now, let's begin. Emily had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Her parents were taking a rare trip out of town, leaving her in charge of the house. At 22, she was more than capable of spending a couple of nights alone. Besides, her golden retriever, Max, was excellent company, loyal, attentive, and quick to bark at anything unusual. Friday evening started off perfectly. She ordered takeout, curled up on the couch, and dove into a binge session of her favorite true crime documentaries. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, the house felt warm and secure. By 10 p.m., the takeout containers were empty, and Max was sprawled across her feet, snoring softly. Emily decided to call it a night. She stretched, turned off the TV, and began her nightly routine. As she brushed her teeth, she noticed something odd. The hallway light seemed dimmer. Not quite flickering, but definitely weaker than usual. She made a mental note to replace the bulb in the morning. Then she heard it, a faint click. Her hand froze mid-brush. It wasn't a loud sound, just subtle enough to be unnerving. She rinsed her mouth and listened intently. Max, usually unbothered by most noises, lifted his head, his ears perked. "Probably just the heater kicking on," she muttered, more to herself than to Max. But as she stepped out into the hallway, she saw it. The door to the basement was ajar, and a dim yellow glow spilled out from the crack. Emily frowned. She was sure she hadn't been near the basement all day, let alone turned on the light. She approached cautiously, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. Max followed closely, his low growl vibrating through the quiet house. The light was steady but unnerving. It bathed the darkened hallway in a sickly hue, contrasting sharply with the cool white light of the other bulbs. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering slightly. Silence. Emily grabbed her phone from the counter, activating the flashlight. She nudged the door open further, revealing the staircase descending into the basement. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door and walk away. Instead, she aimed the light down the stairs. Nothing. Just the usual clutter, boxes, old furniture, and the washer and dryer. But the overhead light was still on. She debated what to do. It was likely just a faulty switch, or maybe she'd accidentally left it on earlier. Yet, as she stood there, staring down into the basement, a strange sense of dread crept over her. "Come on, Max," she said, more for her own comfort than his. Together, they descended the stairs. The basement was as cold and musty as ever. The smell of damp concrete and cardboard filled her nose as she reached the bottom. She quickly scanned the area with her phone's flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, something felt wrong. She approached the light switch and flipped it off. The basement plunged into darkness, save for her phone's beam. She turned to head back upstairs. Emily stopped dead in her tracks. Slowly, she turned around. The light was back on. She stared at the switch. It was definitely in the off position, yet the bulb above her was glowing steadily. "Faulty wiring," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Max growled again, this time louder, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the basement. Emily followed his line of sight, but the corner was empty. At least, it looked empty. "Come on, Max," she said, backing toward the stairs. But Max didn't budge. His growl deepened and his fur bristled. "Max, let's go!" he barked suddenly. A sharp, aggressive sound that made Emily jump. Then she heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the far corner. Her breath caught in her throat. She aimed her phone's flashlight, the beam shaking with her trembling hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer. Max barked again, lunging forward slightly, but Emily grabbed his collar and held him back. "I'm calling the cops!" she shouted, though her hands were frozen, clutching her phone. The footsteps stopped. The basement was eerily silent, save for Max's growls. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she slowly backed toward the stairs, her flashlight still trained on the corner. Suddenly, the light bulb above her flickered violently, casting rapid shadows across the walls. Emily screamed as the shadows seemed to move independently of her and Max, darting and twisting in unnatural ways. She turned and bolted up the stairs, dragging Max with her. She slammed the basement door shut, locking it with shaky hands. For the next hour, Emily sat on the couch, Max by her side, her phone in her lap. She debated calling the police but hesitated. What would she even say? That a light wouldn't turn off? That she thought she heard footsteps? She decided to stay awake, at least until morning. She kept the lights on, the TV playing quietly for background noise. Max eventually settled down, but his ears remained perked, his eyes fixed on the hallway. Around 2 a.m., Emily's phone buzzed. She jumped, nearly dropping it. The screen lit up with a notification. An unknown number was calling. Her stomach churned. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello!" A raspy voice whispered, "Why don't you come back down?" Emily's blood ran cold. She hung up immediately and dialed 911. When the police arrived, they searched the house thoroughly. The basement was empty, just as she'd left it. But near the light switch, they found something that made Emily's skin crawl. A single footprint, large and muddy, leading up the stairs to the basement door. Emily never stayed in that house alone again. To this day, she doesn't know who or what was down there, but she can still hear that voice in her nightmares. What would you have done? Would you have gone into the basement? Let me know in the comments. And if you've had a terrifying experience of your own, I'd love to hear it. Jake had always considered himself a night owl. With both his parents working night shifts at the hospital, he had grown used to spending long evenings alone in their quiet suburban home. At 19, he appreciated the solitude. No rules, no curfews, just him, his gaming setup, and the occasional late-night snack. It was a rainy Thursday night, and Jake was in his usual spot, sitting cross-legged on his bed, headphones on, eyes glued to the glowing screen in front of him. Outside, the storm rumbled softly, but it wasn't loud enough to distract him. The game he was playing required focus, a high-stakes online match where every move could mean the difference between victory and defeat. As the rain intensified, a low, rumbling thunder echoed in the distance. Jake barely noticed. His fingers flew across the keyboard and he leaned in closer to the screen, shouting into his headset. "Come on, come on! Yes!" he yelled triumphantly. Then he heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock at the front door. Jake froze mid-celebration, his victory forgotten. He glanced at the clock on his computer. It was 11:47 p.m. Who would knock at this hour? He slid off his bed, pulled off his headphones, and listened carefully. The storm had muffled the sound, but there was no mistaking it. A knock. 3 slow, measured raps. Jake's first thought was that it might be his parents, though that didn't make sense. They had their own keys, and they always called if they needed him to unlock the door. He crept out of his room, stepping cautiously down the carpeted hallway. Maybe it's just the wind, he muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. As he approached the door, his heartbeat quickened. The hallway felt unnaturally silent, the kind of quiet that seemed to amplify every creak of the house. Jake reached the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. A man stood on the porch, soaked from the rain. He wore a long raincoat, with the hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. His head was bowed, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. Jake's stomach churned. He didn't recognize the man. He cleared his throat and called out through the door. Can I help you?" The man didn't respond immediately. Slowly, he tilted his head upward, just enough for Jake to see his mouth. The man's lips were curled into a faint smile, an unsettling, frozen expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I saw your light," the man said finally, his voice muffled by the storm. "I need to come in." Jake's hand hovered over the lock, but something held him back. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't right. "Sorry, man," Jake said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I'm not opening the door. You should go." The man didn't move. He didn't argue. He just stood there, that eerie smile plastered on his face. "Let me in," he said softly. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm calling the cops if you don't leave," he said, louder this time. The man's smile widened, and for a moment, Jake thought he heard a faint chuckle. Without another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the downpour. Jake exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He double-checked the locks on the door and retreated to his room, trying to shake off the encounter. Story 2. The Late-Night Visitor. Jake had always considered himself a night owl. With both his parents working night shifts at the hospital, he had grown used to spending long evenings alone in their quiet suburban home. At 19, he appreciated the solitude. No rules, no curfews, just him, his gaming setup, and the occasional late-night snack. It was a rainy Thursday night, and Jake was in his usual spot, sitting cross-legged on his bed, headphones on, eyes glued to the glowing screen in front of him. Outside, the storm rumbled softly, but it wasn't loud enough to distract him. The game he was playing required focus, a high-stakes online match where every move could mean the difference between victory and defeat. As the rain intensified, a low, rumbling thunder echoed in the distance. Jake barely noticed. His fingers flew across the keyboard, and he leaned in closer to the screen, shouting into his headset. "Come on! Come on! Yes!" he yelled triumphantly. Then he heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock at the front door. Jake froze mid-celebration, his victory forgotten. He glanced at the clock on his computer. It was 11:47 p.m. Who would knock at this hour? He slid off his bed, pulled off his headphones, and listened carefully. The storm had muffled the sound, but there was no mistaking it. A knock. 3 slow, measured raps. Jake's first thought was that it might be his parents, though that didn't make sense. They had their own keys, and they always called if they needed him to unlock the door. He crept out of his room, stepping cautiously down the carpeted hallway. "Maybe it's just the wind," he muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. As he approached the door, his heartbeat quickened. The hallway felt unnaturally silent, the kind of quiet that seemed to amplify every creak of the house. Jake reached the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. A man stood on the porch, soaked from the rain. He wore a long raincoat with the hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. His head was bowed, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. Jake's stomach churned. He didn't recognize the man. He cleared his throat and called out through the door. Can I help you?" The man didn't respond immediately. Slowly, he tilted his head upward, just enough for Jake to see his mouth. The man's lips were curled into a faint smile, an unsettling, frozen expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I saw your light," the man said finally, his voice muffled by the storm. "I need to come in." Jake's hand hovered over the lock, but something held him back. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't right. "Sorry, man," Jake said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I'm not opening the door. You should go." The man didn't move. He didn't argue. He just stood there, that eerie smile plastered on his face. "Let me in," he said softly. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm calling the cops if you don't leave," he said, louder this time. The man's smile widened, and for a moment Jake thought he heard a faint chuckle. Without another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the downpour. Jake exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He double-checked the locks on the door and retreated to his room, trying to shake off the encounter. Mia wasn't a stranger to late nights. Her graduate program often demanded it. Endless research papers, coding projects, and the looming pressure of deadlines. But tonight was different. Tonight, the house felt too quiet, the air too still. It was nearing 1 a.m., and the world outside her small rental home was silent, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. Her neighborhood wasn't exactly lively, especially on weeknights. That suited Mia just fine. She liked the calm. Her desk was cluttered with empty coffee mugs and scattered notes as she stared at her laptop screen, trying to finish an assignment. Every few minutes, her eyes darted to the corner of the room where a shadow seemed a little too deep, a little too still. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Just as she was beginning to regain her focus, her doorbell rang. The sound was so sudden, so jarring, that Mia's heart leapt into her throat. She froze, staring at the door across the room. Who would ring the bell at this hour? She sat there for a moment, listening. Her rational mind whispered that it was probably just a mistake. A delivery driver lost in the dark, or maybe even her neighbor needing something. But deep down, a knot of unease began to form. The doorbell rang again. Okay, I'm coming," she muttered to herself, her voice shaking slightly. She stood, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor as she approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing. The porch light was on, casting its dim yellow glow across the steps, but the space was empty. Mia frowned, double-checking. "Hello?" she called through the door. No response. A chill ran down her spine. She debated calling someone, her roommate, her parents, even the police, but decided against it. Maybe it was a prank. As she turned to walk away, something caught her eye through the side window. A package, small and brown, sat on the porch. She hesitated. Mia hadn't ordered anything, and it was odd that the delivery person would ring the bell and leave without saying a word. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She unlocked the door, cracked it open, and quickly grabbed the box before retreating back inside. The package was unremarkable, plain, with no markings or return address. It felt light, as though whatever was inside barely weighed anything at all. "Probably just a mix-up," she muttered, setting it on the kitchen counter. She decided to leave it alone for now, returning to her desk, but no matter how hard she tried to focus, the box lingered in the back of her mind. Finally, after what felt like hours, she gave in. She grabbed a pair of scissors, slicing through the tape with shaky hands. Inside was a small, outdated tape recorder. Its plastic casing was scratched and worn, and a piece of masking tape labeled it simply, "Play Me." Mia's stomach churned. Everything about this was wrong. She should have called the police, should have thrown it out. But instead, she pressed the button. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice emerged. Faint, distorted, and cold. "You're alone." Mia's hand flew to her mouth. The voice continued, "I'm coming for you." She slammed the stop button, her heart racing. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at the recorder as though it might come to life on its own. Then it started playing again. She hadn't pressed anything. This time, the voice was different, closer, sharper, almost mocking. "I see you." Mia dropped the recorder, her pulse thundering in her ears. She stumbled backward, her gaze darting to the windows. The curtains were drawn, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. As the operator answered, Mia struggled to explain what was happening. There's this package," she stammered. "It has a tape recorder, and someone's—" Her words cut off as a sound echoed from the kitchen. The sound of something scraping against the counter. Mia's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, the phone still pressed to her ear. The box was gone. "What's your address, ma'am?" the operator asked, her voice calm but firm. "It's—" Mia began, but the words caught in her throat. The scraping sound grew louder, moving down the hall toward her. "Ma'am, are you still there?" Mia forced herself to move. She bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. "There's someone in my house," she whispered into the phone, tears streaming down her face. "Please, send someone." The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. From her bedroom, Mia could hear faint noises, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the occasional thud. And then, silence. Mia pressed her ear to the door, straining to listen. The quiet was more terrifying than the noises. She reached for her bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Her phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, it was a text from an unknown number. "Look under the bed." Mia's breath hitched. She didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what she already feared, but as she lay there, paralyzed with fear, she realized she didn't have a choice. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor. The space under the bed was dark, shadowy, but empty, at least at first glance. Then she saw it, the tape recorder, sitting in the far corner, glowing faintly. Before she could react, the recorder started playing on its own. The voice was no longer distorted. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. "I told you, I'm coming for you." Mia scrambled to her feet, clutching her phone as the sound of pounding footsteps erupted in the hallway. The door to her room rattled violently, as though someone was trying to break it down. When the police arrived, they found Mia huddled in the corner of her bedroom, her face pale and her hands trembling. The house was empty, no sign of forced entry, no intruders, but the tape recorder was gone. As the officers searched the house, one of them called Mia over. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding up a small Polaroid photo. Mia took it with shaking hands. It showed her, crouched on the floor, staring under the bed. The caption written at the bottom sent shivers down her spine. "Next time, I won't knock." Mia moved out of the house the next day, abandoning her belongings and refusing to stay another night. To this day, she doesn't know who or what left that package on her porch. What would you have done if you'd received that package? Have you ever had a delivery that didn't feel quite right? Let me know in the comments below, and if you've had a creepy experience of your own, send it in. It might just be featured in the next video. Sam had always considered himself cautious. Living alone in his one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an older building in the city made him a little paranoid. Every night, he double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, a habit born from years of hearing too many true crime stories. Still, he liked the place. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, with enough space for him and his books, and it had a nice view of the street below. He especially liked the large window in the living room, even though it faced a busy alley. One Friday night, after a long day at work, Sam decided to stay in. He made a quick dinner, settled onto the couch, and started scrolling through a streaming app, trying to find something to watch. Outside, the city hummed with its usual late-night noises, distant conversations, the occasional car horn, and the faint rustle of wind. He'd just started a thriller movie when he heard a noise. It was faint but distinct, a soft tap on glass. Sam paused the movie and listened. His eyes darted to the large window. It was locked, just as it always was, and the curtains were drawn. Another tap. This time, Sam stood and approached the window cautiously. He peeked out through a small gap in the curtains. The alley below was empty. No one stood outside. No branches brushed against the window. Nothing seemed out of place. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, shaking his head. He drew the curtains tightly shut and returned to the couch. But the tapping didn't stop. It came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Sam's heart raced as he got up once more, this time pulling the curtain aside in a single motion. The alley was still empty. The window, though, seemed different. He leaned closer and realized there were smudges on the glass, faint but unmistakable. They looked like handprints. Sam's throat tightened. The window was on the third floor. There was no fire escape, no balcony, nothing for someone to stand on. He locked the window again, even though it was already secure, and checked it several times, just to be sure. Then he closed the curtains, grabbed his phone, and sat back down, trying to ignore the unease settling over him. An hour passed. Sam managed to distract himself with his movie, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, he glanced toward the window, half expecting to see something, or someone, peering through. At 11:30, he decided to call it a night. He turned off the TV, checked the front door lock, and headed to the bedroom. As he passed the window, he gave it one last look. The smudges were gone. That should have comforted him. Instead, it sent a chill down his spine. He told himself he must have imagined it, that the smudges were probably shadows or dirt from outside. Still, he double-checked the lock again before heading to bed. Sam woke up to the sound of creaking. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The sound was faint, like someone stepping slowly across the floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No response. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, turning on the flashlight. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to creep through. Sam's pulse quickened. He was certain he'd closed it before going to sleep. He swung his legs over the bed and crept toward the door, flashlight shaking in his hand. The creaking grew louder as he approached, coming from the living room. When he reached the door, he stopped, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. He flung the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty, exactly as he'd left it. But the curtains were open. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He distinctly remembered closing them before bed. He rushed to the window, pulling the curtains shut again. That's when he saw it. A single fingerprint smudged on the inside of the glass. Sam backed away, his mind racing. It didn't make sense. The window had been locked. No one could have gotten in, right? He grabbed a kitchen knife and sat on the couch, his phone clutched tightly in his other hand. For hours he sat there, listening to the apartment's every creak and groan, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he dozed off. He woke with a start to the sound of shattering glass. Sam leaped to his feet, the knife ready in his hand. The living room window was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The curtains billowed in the wind. He stared in disbelief. He hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen anything. Then he noticed it. Wet footprints leading from the window to the hallway. Sam's hands shook as he dialed 911. He stumbled toward the door, intending to leave the apartment and wait for the police outside. But as he reached for the doorknob, he froze. The footprints didn't lead out of the apartment. They led to the bedroom. Sam's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. Slowly he crept toward the bedroom, knife and phone still in hand. The door was closed, just as he'd left it. He pushed it open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. The footprints ended in the middle of the room, where they simply stopped. There was no sign of anyone, no place for anyone to hide. Sam backed out of the room, his heart pounding. The police arrived minutes later, but their search turned up nothing. The broken window and footprints were the only signs that anything had happened. The next morning, Sam began packing his things. He couldn't stay in the apartment, not after what had happened. As he loaded the last of his boxes into his car, he looked up at the living room window one last time. The curtains were open again, and in the window, he saw a figure standing there, staring down at him. Sam never returned to the apartment. To this day, he doesn't know who or what was in his home that night. But sometimes, he swears he sees smudges on his car windows, as though someone, or something, is still watching him. What would you have done if you were in Sam's shoes? Have you ever had an experience where you felt watched? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to share your own story. It might just be featured in the next video. Vanessa never liked the mirror in her parents' hallway. It was an old antique, passed down through her family for generations. The heavy, ornate frame had been carved from dark wood, its swirling patterns giving the impression of tangled vines, or perhaps something darker. The glass itself was tarnished, speckled with imperfections that warped reflections just enough to make them feel wrong. But her mother adored it. "It's part of our history," she would say, gently dusting the frame. "One day, it'll be yours to keep." Vanessa never wanted it. In fact, she avoided the mirror as much as possible, walking quickly past it and averting her eyes whenever she could. It wasn't just the distorted reflections that bothered her, it was the way it felt, as though something watched her from the other side. Still, it was just a mirror. At least, that's what she told herself. That illusion shattered one night when Vanessa was left home alone. It was a rainy evening in early autumn. Her parents were out of town visiting friends, leaving her to house-sit for the weekend. Vanessa didn't mind. She was 24, perfectly capable of taking care of herself, and she enjoyed the quiet. By 10 p.m., the rain had intensified, drumming steadily against the roof and windows. Vanessa was curled up on the couch in the living room, a cup of tea in her hands, and a true crime documentary playing softly on the TV. That's when she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Vanessa froze. Her parents' house was old, and it often creaked and groaned in the wind. But this wasn't the usual settling of the house. These were deliberate, rhythmic steps. She placed her tea on the coffee table and muted the TV, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, growing louder, until they stopped just outside the living room door. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking slightly. No answer. Vanessa stood, clutching her phone, and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The only light came from a small lamp at the far end, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted with every flicker. The house was eerily silent, except for the rain. The mirror caught her eye. It hung midway down the hallway, its surface reflecting the dim glow of the lamp. Vanessa hesitated, her stomach twisting. The distorted glass seemed darker than usual, as though it absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She took a step closer. As she approached, she kept her eyes on the mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing behind her. But the hallway was empty. Still, the closer she got, the more she felt an inexplicable pull toward the mirror. Her skin prickled, and a chill ran down her spine. When she was finally standing in front of it, she realized she wasn't looking at herself. Not exactly. The reflection mimicked her movements, but something about it was off. The eyes of her reflection seemed too dark, too hollow, and the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corners of its mouth. An expression Vanessa knew she wasn't making. She took a step back, her breath quickening. Her reflection's smile widened. Vanessa blinked, and the reflection was normal again, just her own face, pale and wide-eyed. She let out a shaky laugh, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as she turned to walk away, the reflection didn't move. Vanessa froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was still there, standing completely still, its head tilted slightly to the side. "Who are you?" Vanessa whispered, barely able to get the words out. The reflection's mouth moved, though no sound came out. Vanessa stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She turned and ran into the living room, slamming the door behind her. For the next half hour, Vanessa sat on the couch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She tried to convince herself it was stress or exhaustion, or the flickering light playing tricks on her mind. But she couldn't stop shaking. Her phone buzzed, startling her. She grabbed it, grateful for the distraction, but the screen showed a message from an unknown number. "Why did you run?" Vanessa dropped the phone as though it had burned her. The text didn't make sense. She hadn't told anyone about the mirror. Who could possibly know? The lamp in the corner flickered, and she heard a faint tap, tap, tap on the living room window. Her stomach twisted. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. There was no one there. She exhaled shakily, but the relief was short-lived. When she glanced back at her phone, a new text had appeared. "I'm inside." Vanessa bolted to the front door, fumbling with the locks. But as she opened it, she saw something that made her stop cold. The hallway mirror. It was no longer hanging on the wall. It was leaning against the far end of the hallway, tilted toward her. She stared in disbelief. That mirror weighed a ton. There was no way it could have moved on its own. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but her eyes flicked to the screen. "Come closer." The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing heavy and cold. Vanessa's instincts screamed at her to leave, to run as far away as she could, but her legs wouldn't move. Against her better judgment, she stepped into the hallway. The mirror's surface was darker now, almost black, like a void swallowing the dim light. Vanessa approached cautiously, her breathing shallow. When she was just a few feet away, the glass shifted. It wasn't a reflection anymore, it was something else entirely. A face emerged, pale and angular, with hollow black eyes and a grin that stretched unnaturally wide. "Vanessa," it whispered, its voice rasping like dry leaves. "You belong here." She stumbled back, tripping over her feet and landing hard on the floor. The face pressed closer to the glass, as though trying to push through. Vanessa scrambled to her feet and ran for the front door, throwing it open and sprinting into the rain. When her parents returned the next day, they found the house in perfect order, except for one thing. The mirror was gone. Vanessa refused to explain what had happened. She moved out the following week, cutting all ties with the house. But sometimes, in reflective surfaces, a window, a phone screen, even a puddle, she catches glimpses of that face. Watching. Waiting. Vanessa learned that some things are better left untouched, unseen and unspoken. But what would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed? Let me know in the comments below, and if you've ever had a strange encounter with a mirror, I want to hear your story. The shadow at the door. Liam had never been afraid of the dark. As a kid, he was the one who dared his friends to explore basements and abandoned houses. Even as an adult, he found comfort in solitude and the quiet of the night. But all of that changed the night he moved into his new home. It was a modest house, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Liam had recently landed a new job in the area and was excited to start fresh. The house was a fixer-upper, but he loved the charm of its creaky floors and old-fashioned design. The first week was uneventful. Liam spent most of his time unpacking and cleaning, getting the place in order. But as he settled into his new routine, he began to notice strange things. Small, almost unremarkable details that gnawed at the edge of his mind. At first, it was the doors. No matter how many times he closed them, he would find them slightly ajar. The bathroom door, the closet door, even the front door. They all seemed to open just a crack when his back was turned. He told himself it was the draft. The house was old, after all. But then there were the noises. Late at night, as he lay in bed, he would hear faint creaks and groans coming from the hallway. He convinced himself it was just the house settling. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. One Friday night, Liam stayed up late, working on his laptop. He was sitting at the dining table, the only light coming from the lamp above him. The rest of the house was cloaked in darkness. Around midnight, he got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. As he reached for a glass, he froze. A sound, faint but distinct, came from the front door. A soft tap, tap, tap. Liam's stomach tightened. It wasn't a knock exactly, but more like the sound of fingernails rapping lightly against the wood. He set the glass down and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing. The porch was empty. He opened the door a crack and looked out. The street was quiet, the houses dark. A gust of cool wind rustled the leaves, but there was no sign of anyone. Shaking his head, he locked the door and returned to the dining table. But as he sat down, he felt it. A prickle at the back of his neck, as though he were being watched. The next few nights, the tapping continued. Always faint, always at the same time. Midnight. Liam started to feel paranoid, his nerves fraying with each sleepless night. He began checking the locks obsessively, even setting up his phone to record the front door while he slept. The first night he reviewed the footage, he saw nothing unusual. But on the second night, as the tapping began, the porch light flickered. For a split second, the video caught something, a shadow, tall and thin, standing just outside the frame. It didn't move. It didn't knock. It simply stood there, as though waiting. Liam's chest tightened as he replayed the footage over and over. The shadow didn't make sense. There was no one on the street, no trees or objects that could have caused it. "What do you want?" he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. That weekend, Liam invited his friend Mark over, hoping for some company to ease his growing unease. "You've been working too hard," Mark joked as he cracked open a beer. "Probably just imagining things." Liam nodded, trying to laugh it off. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, the tapping returned. Mark froze mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the front door. "What the hell was that?" Liam stood, his heart pounding. "That's what I've been telling you. It happens every night." Mark followed him to the door, his expression serious now. They both listened as the tapping continued, soft and rhythmic. Liam reached for the peephole, but Mark grabbed his arm. "Don't," Mark said. "Let's just wait." They stood there for what felt like hours, the tapping growing fainter until it finally stopped. Mark exhaled sharply. "Okay, that was creepy. But maybe it's just some kid messing with you." "Maybe," Liam muttered, though he didn't believe it. The next night, Liam decided to confront whatever, or whoever, was outside. He sat in the dark, his eyes fixed on the front door, a baseball bat resting against his knee. When the tapping started, he didn't hesitate. He flung the door open, bat raised, ready to strike, but the porch was empty. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the chilly air. The street was silent, the shadows deep and still. "Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the night. There was no response. But as he turned to go back inside, he noticed something. On the door, just below the peephole, were 3 long scratches, as though something sharp had been dragged across the wood. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Liam began hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, soft and deliberate. Doors would slam shut on their own, and objects would move inexplicably. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from just outside his bedroom door. "Let me in." Liam sat up, his heart racing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." He grabbed his phone and called Mark, his hands trembling. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice shaking. "Something's wrong with this house." Mark arrived within the hour, his face pale as he listened to Liam recount everything that had happened. "You're leaving," Mark said firmly. "Pack your stuff. You're staying with me tonight." As they loaded Liam's belongings into Mark's car, the two friends avoided looking at the house. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself was watching them. But just as Liam was about to get into the car, he glanced at the front door one last time. The shadow was there, standing in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched as they drove away. Liam never returned to the house. He sold it as quickly as he could, leaving behind everything he couldn't take with him. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears the tapping, soft, rhythmic, and unrelenting. What would you have done if you were Liam? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in your home? Share your story in the comments, and it might just be featured in our next video. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. And remember, you never know what's lurking when you're home alone. Send your stories to the email below in the description, and they could be featured in the next video. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.